All right, hello class, this is Professor Ellsworth, and in this, our final video for this unit, Chapter 2, I'm going to be covering what I believe to be the most important part of this chapter, Section 2-6, in which we are introduced and we learn a little bit about the two primary contemporary ethical fields of study, or approaches. The first, Kantianism, the second, Utilitarianism. What I'm going to be doing in this video is providing an overview of these and explaining kind of how these are, how you can understand these. And this is important because for the remaining part of this term, these are going to be the two primary ways that we're going to be analyzing and trying to think about these ethical decisions. You know, many people wear those wristbands, or at least they used to 15 years ago. WWJD, what would Jesus do? Right, and the purpose of that wristband was to serve as essentially like a moral compass, that when faced with a dilemma or a chance to make a decision, right, the person would think about what Jesus would do in that scenario and do what Jesus would do. Now, in the absence of any type of religious, ethical, or moral guidepost, you know, some people who consider themselves Kantianism or Kantists or utilitarianists kind of adhere to a similar thought process. All right, well, I believe in the Kantian approach, and therefore I'm going to use this as my guidepost when making moral decisions. Let me try to explain these to you and give you a couple of examples and demonstrate this thought process in play. So first, Kantianism was named for its kind of founder, its creator, Immanuel Kant. Kantianism is not an ethical relativist approach. Remember from our last little video, the previous section, ethical relativism believes that there are no universal ethical standards or values, that it is all completely relative to the individual and the time and the culture and the place. Kant does not believe that. He believes that there are universal principles that apply to all people at all times in all scenarios. And the way that he will formulate his ideas is he will write them out in a series of treatises. Now, he believes that consequences matter, but consequences don't matter as much, or shouldn't matter as much when making a decision. Let me pause for a second. My son is yelling in my ear. All right, so I'm back. So Kant believes that consequences matter, but are really secondary. That when we make a decision, that our driving force shouldn't be the impact of that decision or the consequence of that decision. Instead, he believes in the value of our decisions, and that those actions should define themselves, should speak for themselves. So when we make a decision, we don't consider what the impact will be, but we consider kind of universally, is this how I would want someone to act? Is this kind of the way that people should act at all times? So he will outline what he considers his categorical imperative, a requirement that all must follow. And that's kind of his approach. So he believes first that we follow the rules or the maxims that we want all people to follow. So for instance, he might take honesty as his maxim. Does he want all people to be honest at all times? He would consider that, conduct a mental exercise, consider various scenarios. Now, is it best to be honest? If a cashier gave you extra money, right, is the right decision to be honest? If your spouse asks them if an outfit makes them look good, is it best to be honest? Now, some people believe that yes, honesty is the best policy. It is best to be honest. And if it's good to be honest in one scenario, then it is best to be honest in all scenarios. So this is a very simplistic approach. essentially, if you are adhering to a Kantian perspective of ethics, you have a code of conduct. You know how you will respond. You know what to do. You know, for instance, that you will not break a promise. That if you say something, that you will do that. And you believe that that is a best policy that all people should do. That would help to keep from treaties from being broken, from people lying to each other, people cheating on each other, that is a way of bringing about a lot of good. And so if you believe that all people shouldn't break a promise, then when facing a scenario in which you have to decide whether or not you will break a promise or not, it is a simple decision. You will not break a promise regardless of the consequences. And so this is very straightforward. I mean, there's a simplicity, a beauty to this. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. It doesn't matter if you're hurting yourself or if other people are impacted or it hurts other people. If it's right in one scenario, then it's right in all scenarios. The second major part of Kantian's approach to ethics is what is labeled the practical imperative. And this is the idea that we should never treat other persons as a means to an end, but we should only treat people as ends unto themselves. And this means that as our guiding force, that we should treat all people with dignity and respect. Now that the categorical imperative and the practical imperative will provide the basis for these decisions that Kant would make and those who adhere to this approach to ethics. Now the second is utilitarianism. Now utilitarianism is often, credit is often given to John Stuart Mills for kind of originating this approach. Now Mills and utilitarianism, like Kantianism, is also not an ethical relativist approach. It believes that there are universal values. However, one way that utilitarianism differs from Kantianism is that utilitarianism focuses on the consequences. Now, as Mills wrote, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and they are wrong as they produce the reverse of happiness. So when deciding whether an action is right or wrong, what Mills would advise one to do is to measure the happiness produced and to make the decision that produces the most happiness, or in a case where there are no outcomes that produce happiness, to minimize the reverse of happiness. So what's unique about this is that consequences are the only thing that matter. Whereas Kant and Kantianism are looking for universal truths, looking to act in the same way every time regardless of the consequence, utilitarianism only makes their decision based on the consequence, and the consequence that brings about the most good or that brings about the least amount of bad. So our decisions seek to maximize happiness for the most people. And so clearly the consequences to determine what is right and what is wrong. That right and wrong isn't universal, but a right and a wrong decision is based off of the consequence, and which one does the most good or the most happiness or brings about the least amount of the opposite of happiness. So how do we measure good? Does this apply to the moment? Does this apply to the future? Now let me give you a scenario. Let's say that you are a chauffeur and you are driving Bill Gates in your car. And as you are driving down the road, you see a woman and a child walking across the road. You immediately know that you are going too fast, that there's no way that you can stop the car in time from hitting her. But you have two other decisions. So first, you could plow through the intersection and you will kill a woman and a child. Second, you could veer to the right, and in doing this, you will slam into a giant stone wall. And at the speed that you're going and the angle that you would hit, it would mean that you would kill Bill Gates. Or third, you could go to the left, and you could run into an oncoming bus full of elderly people on their way home to retirement community. In doing this, you factored it all out. Nothing wrong would happen to you, but it would cause this bus to swerve off the road, plummet off of a cliff, and that all 50 people on this bus would die. But Bill Gates would survive, and the woman and the child would survive. So the question is, what do you do? Do you hit the woman and the child? Do you kill Bill Gates? Or do you cause 50 people to fall off of the cliff and die? So if we were approaching this from a utilitarianism perspective, our decision would be determined off of what would cause the most happiness. Now, in this case, I don't think any decision would cause any happiness. In all instances, people will be hurt, people will be injured. So if you ran into the woman and the child, so you would definitely not make her and that child happy. So that is a negative. But you'll also be causing perhaps her family to have a negative experience. Maybe there's a husband at home who's waiting for his wife and child to come home, right? So you'll be causing harm to him. Don't forget, this child has an entire life to live. And so when considering the value of that life and the amount of good over time, this child, there's a lot at stake here. Now, if you swerve right and kill Bill Gates, the woman and the child would survive, and you would survive, and those 50 old people would survive, but Bill Gates would die. Now, again, Bill Gates, how old is he now? He's in his 60s, maybe 70s. He's extremely wealthy. He has a family. So, of course, his family would be impacted. He's also somewhat of a celebrity. So we would imagine that because of his death and the timing of his death and the traumatic instance of his death, that there would be a lot of mourning that would take place. But you also remember that Bill Gates has pledged all of his money to charities. And so, in the timing of Bill Gates' death, there would be a landfall of money that would be donated to a variety of charities, which may increase the quality of life for hundreds, thousands, millions of people. Now, does the suffering of Bill Gates and his family, how does that measure out with the benefit of all of that income, all of that money being donated to these charities, given out to these organizations? Does that weigh itself out? Does the loss of a life, how do you place a price tag on that? And third, you run a bus off of the highway and 50 old people die. Now you might say, well, they have little time to live, perhaps. Maybe the quality of their life wasn't great. Maybe you would even argue that for some of those elderly people, you were doing them a favor. But then we also have to consider the number of people impacted, the number of families that would be impacted. And so in making a decision using utilitarianism, you would have to consider how would you maximize happiness for the most number of people? Or, in a scenario in which there is no good result, how would you minimize the opposite of happiness for the most amount of people? What does the least amount of damage? And so that is the mental exercise that you would go through as a utilitarianist as you try to make the decision on what you should do. Now, on the other end, Kant. How would Kant approach this scenario? Kant would first, ask himself, what rules should be applied here. And maybe the rule is that you do not kill. Well, here we have an instance where we are going to kill. And so the second part of this is that we never treat people as a means to an end, but only as an ends in themselves, and that we treat people with dignity and respect. Oh, crap. Hold on. Pausing for a minute. Okay, sorry. I looked up and my son was running around with a gallon of milk. He's a year and a half old, and I did not want that to spill. All right, so where I left off, we were talking about how Kant would apply his theories to this scenario, and ultimately he would have to decide: is he treating people as an end to themselves? Is he treating people with dignity? In one case, right, he has no choice. His choices have already been made. He has been traveling so fast that he has no choice but to hit these people. But he would have to make a conscious decision to kill, if he were to steer to the right and hit the rock, to kill Bill Gates, or to steer to the left, he would have to make a conscious decision to kill those 50 people. And in so doing, he would be treating those people as a means to an end, as a means of escaping from killing this woman and child in front of him. And so in my reading, I would believe that a Kantianist approach would be, even though it's wrong, that he would continue forward and kill the woman and child. Anyways, we'll be talking a lot more about Kantianism and utilitarianism this term. This is meant primarily to be a primer to it, to help you maybe in future weeks as you are struggling, or if you struggle with these terms, a chance to come back and get a refresher over what these ideas mean and how they apply to specific situations.